Hello everyone! This last Christmas, for the very first time in my life, I prepared and ate a roast Christmas goose. And in this video, I'm going to show you that whole process, and I'm also going to tell you some really cool facts about geese. It was a really wild and interesting experience for me. The goose was not wild, it's a domestic goose, but the experience was wild and interesting for me. It's totally different from preparing a chicken or a turkey, and I think you'll find it really interesting. First fun fact about geese is that 95% of the geese sold for food in the United States come from one single farm in South Dakota. And in fact, my goose comes from that farm too. The story is actually kind of neat. The farmer's wife back in 1945 was out walking with her daughter and they found some goose eggs that had been left alone. And they brought them home, incubated them, and began to raise them. And from there, the operation expanded, and now they sell, I believe, over 10,000 geese every year. You might also be wondering about the tradition of a Christmas goose. You may have heard the song, "Christmas is coming and the goose is getting fat, please put a penny in the old man's hat." And a Christmas goose is kind of a traditional dish. What I found out looking into this is that it actually hails back to the Middle Ages. This is pre-Columbian exchange. This is before turkeys came over from the Americas. So while we often think of turkeys as sort of a traditional Thanksgiving and Christmas food, in the Middle Ages, goose was just kind of a nice, solid, middle-class Christmas meal. If you were in the upper crust, you'd probably be eating something like pheasant or peacock for Christmas, and I don't have one of those, but we might do that in the future. So why don't we eat a Christmas goose anymore, or at least not very much? There are a few possible reasons, but I think mostly the answer just comes down to economics. Chicken and turkeys can be raised quite cheaply, largely due to the fact that they do not have much of a need for space. You can raise chickens and turkeys in a fairly cooped up space, and for that reason, chickens and turkeys, whole chickens and turkeys, might run for $1 a pound or $2 a pound, somewhere in that range. Whereas, by contrast, geese actually will not tolerate being raised in a small space. They need something more like 25 square feet or more per bird. And for that reason, a goose is going to be quite a bit more expensive, maybe somewhere on the order of $10 to $15 a pound. So the goose I have here is about 14 pounds, and that's different from what you might expect from, say, a turkey. A turkey can go up to 18 or 19 or 20 pounds, but 14 pounds for a goose is actually already pretty large. You might only buy a young goose that is something more on the order of only 10 pounds. I suspect that's another reason for the popularity of the turkey. If you're cooking for a large crowd, then a 20-pound turkey is just really going to hit the spot, and a 14-pound goose is not going to cut it. A significant amount of that weight, comparatively more than for a turkey, is also locked up in the bones, and particularly in the fat. Although the meat of a goose is lean, there is a lot of fat. They were not kidding in the song when they said, "The goose is getting fat," and I will have a lot to say about that. One of the things that surprised me right off the bat as I began to prep the goose was the thickness of the skin. If you've prepped a chicken or a turkey, you know that the skin is there and it does have some fat, but there's not that much skin. It's quite thin. By contrast, on a goose, the skin is very, very thick. It's holding a lot of fat. And the purpose of that fat, remember that goose is a waterfowl, the purpose of that fat is to keep the goose warm as it's on the water. People are the same way, by the way. You can pinch your skin to see your body fat percentage.
Yeah.
Like if you pinch your skin here, you can see there's like no fat there.
Right.
But like if you pinch your stomach, you're like, oh, like
you're like,
I do have some.
Fat.
You're like, I'm fat. So geese neck are longer than turkey necks, as it turns out.
No freaking way.
Way.
Ah, I just watched you pull that out and I'm horrified.
Another crazy part of prepping this goose was going into the body cavity and pulling out fat. You see, although a goose is quite fatty, it's not because the fat is marbled into the meat. It's not intramuscular fat. Instead, it's fat that is sitting in the skin, and also it's just sitting inside the body cavity. And so you reach into the body cavity and you just pull out gobs of fat. And it is the strangest thing ever. Like, you just reach in and there's fat. And most of that fat was bonded to tissue. You know, like for instance, if you're prepping a brisket, most of the fat cap, it's not pure fat, it's fat sort of in fat cells. It's in body tissue. Most of the fat here in the cavity of the goose was like that and had to be rendered down, but some of it was almost like pulling coconut oil out, just pure fat. Okay, so allegedly I can
guess-
reach in here and pull out a glob of fat. Does that count?
I guess the whole thing is the neck, and they just bent.
Oh my goodness! It's oh my goodness!
Fat boy.
Woo! Oh my goodness! So I just reached inside and pulled out a glob of fat. Like that's all there was to it. You just reach inside and you're like
That was inside.
Oh my gosh.
glop.
That's great. That's how you know.
Oh my
he's meant to
goodness.
survive.
Oh my goodness! Yep, I just reach inside and I'm like glop.
Oh, the fat.
Yeah, that's all inside the bird.
You're not kidding.
Glop.
Are you? You know what this looks like? This looks like a turkey that like got madly in shape and put on a breastplate.
It's like a fit turkey, a CrossFit turkey.
A CrossFit turkey.
How do you know this CrossFit? Because it tells you. Squawk, squawk, I do CrossFit. Tissue? I don't know. But yeah, like, look at that. Look how thick that skin is.
Is that all?
Yeah, and the wings,
I'm sure you didn't.
very, very, very different.
Huh?
I told you.
Right.
So I have my arms up and bend
Oh
up,
my
like,
goodness.
Here.
What am I feeling?
What is this thing?
How are you feeling?
It's just like a flap. This is its neck skin!
Oh my god.
Look at that! That's
the
the
head
neck
too?
skin!
No, so the neck is right there.
You
I
could
don't
put
think
the
head's
neck back in
included.
it. Ah!
Yeah, should we?
Oh,
Can you
there's
quit
splattering
flipping-
blood, but anyway.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, there
Sort
you
of.
go. Yeah.
Ah, you can kind of get the
This
picture.
is what it looked like, guys.
Ooh, the neck. Yeah.
This was our goose. This was our goose when it was growing up in South Dakota.
Is that where it grew up?
It grew up in South Dakota. So there you
Do
go.
I grow up some of our
I can
own
see
hair?
the goose.
That neck.
I'll be returning to the subject of fat later because the fattiness of the goose is one of the things that makes it such a desirable dish in the eyes of many people. Of course, in general, a fatty meat is probably going to be more flavorful than a lean meat. That's one of the reasons why many people prefer the dark meat on a turkey to the white meat. The white meat has less fat. Geese have two advantages going for them in that department. The first is just that the large amount of fat on the goose means that it's going to be continuously basted in fat, and you're going to end up with an extremely flavorful dish. The second thing that geese have going for them in the flavor department, as far as fat goes, is the fact that goose fat is actually especially desirable. It's regarded as especially good fat. What I'm doing right now is scoring the skin of the goose with a sharp knife, and to do that you just run the sharp point of the knife in a diamond pattern across every part of the skin. And the goal here is to disturb the skin so that the fat can flow more easily, so that when you're roasting the bird, that fat is released from the skin and flows all over the bird. You can also do this by piercing the skin with a thick needle. All the instructions I read said to be careful to only score the skin and not disturb the meat beneath. And I think that's good advice, but kind of unnecessary in my opinion, because the skin is so fat that you're not in very much danger of accidentally hitting the meat. As far as flavoring, I just went for a really simple celery, onion, rosemary, sage, and thyme stuffing on the inside, and then I also put lemon juice on the outside of the skin and dusted it with kosher salt. The flavor and seasoning profile for roast goose is actually quite similar to other poultry. Things like citrus are great, and that's very surprising actually, considering how different goose meat is from chicken or turkey. And now that I'm ready to roast it, let's talk about that. So a chicken or turkey is always cooked up to a high temperature, around 170 or 180 degrees Fahrenheit. You would never, ever, or almost never, there is such thing as chicken sushi, you would almost never cook a chicken or turkey to a medium rare temperature. You would never cook it to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. And you want to know something cool about geese? You cook them medium rare. That's right, no salmonella, no worries whatsoever on that front. In principle, it is even safe to eat raw. You see, the meat on a waterfowl, like a goose or a duck, is much more like red meat, it's much more like beef, than it is like chicken or turkey. In fact, cooking the goose medium rare is not only an option, it's almost mandatory, since if you cook it to a full temperature of 160 or 170 degrees, it gets a rubbery texture and starts to taste like liver. While my goose got cooked, I set myself to rendering out the delicious aromatic goose fat. And the procedure for that is pretty simple. It's a lot like cooking bacon. You just put the fatty tissue in a pan over low heat, and over time, that low heat renders all the fat right out of the tissue. There are, however, 2 pro tips that can make it an easier, faster process. One is to cut up the tissue into smaller pieces to speed up the rendering, and then another pro tip is to put some water in the pan. And what that does is it makes it so that the fat that has already rendered out does not burn on the hot pan, while the rest of the fat continues to render out. Over time, the pieces of fatty tissue shrink as more and more fat is rendered out of them, and when it begins to brown and the pieces of tissue are quite small and crinkled, that's when you know you're done. This is actually even probably a little bit more rendered than is absolutely necessary, but fortunately there was no real harm done in that. Naturally, I had to try some of the goose fat on potatoes to see if it was as good as everyone said it was, and let me tell you, it is not overhyped. It is delicious. I really don't know how to describe the taste. It's just very round and rich and smooth and flavorful. It truly is something special, and if you ever get a chance to have goose fat on probably anything, you should probably take it. And with the internal temperature of the goose at 135 degrees Fahrenheit, it is time to take it off and to remove the breasts. And you can see that the physiology is really similar, obviously, to what a turkey or chicken would be, but there are also some interesting differences. For instance, notice that the breastbone is quite a bit longer than it is on a turkey or a chicken, and notice also that the breasts are a bit thinner and wider than you would expect from, say, a turkey. But overall, by far, the strangest thing was seeing the color and the texture of what was inside here. To see red juices coming out of a cooked bird is just not an experience that I have ever had before. I'm used to my steak being bloody. I am not used to my poultry being bloody. The texture of the meat was really strange too. You can see that it is almost beef-like. It's very dark. It's very rich. It's not at all like the pale, sometimes stringy meat that you might find on a turkey breast. As far as the taste, here is my assessment and opinion. It does taste kind of like beef, but a little more gamey, sort of in the same way that lamb is a little bit more gamey than beef. I really like the additional gaminess. I'm a big fan of that. Not everyone is, but I am. It feels a lot like eating beef that is extra flavorful. It just has a little bit more fat. It's not greasy, but it just has a little bit more fat and flavor than you might expect. Overall, I'm not sure it's my favorite kind of meat, partially perhaps just because of the strangeness and novelty of the experience, but it was very good. I would like to do it again, and it was an experience worth having. Okay, now let's talk about the legs for a minute. So every recipe that I read says that after you take off the breasts at medium rare, you put the legs back in the oven and you continue to roast them until they come up to a full temperature, around say 170 or 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And honestly, I am not sure if that is absolutely necessary. I'm just not aware of any reason why the legs have to be cooked to that temperature if the breasts do not have to be cooked to that temperature. Now, there might be a reason. If so, I don't know it. If you do know it, please tell me and enlighten me in the comments below. The leg meat was similar in taste and texture to the breast meat, perhaps a little bit tougher, and maybe that was because it was overcooked. That's my hypothesis. However, in general, it was just very delicious, exactly the same as the breast, wonderful, flavorful. I will say that the bottom of the goose is kind of hard to take apart. It's much harder to take apart than any turkey that I've ever taken apart. So one thing I learned here is that apparently geese are just tougher birds than turkeys are. At the end of the day, probably the ideal way to cook and eat a goose is to roast the goose for dinner, eat the breasts for dinner, and then to save the leg meat in order to make some kind of soup after. If I were to do this again, I think I would cook the legs medium rare and just try that and see if it made any kind of a difference. As I was doing research for this video, I couldn't help but find myself thinking about the philosophical significance of geese. And as it turns out, yes, they do actually have some philosophical significance. It finally came to a head for me and became clear when I learned about a certain story from Roman history. According to Roman legend, around 390 BC, Gallic tribes invaded and almost conquered Rome. And what actually saved the city was geese. One of the 7 hills of Rome is the hill Capitoline, and on the top of the hill Capitoline is the temple of Juno, and geese were sacred to Juno and kept on the temple premises. The story goes that one night, the Gallic armies tried to break the siege by scaling up the steep side of the hill Capitoline in order to invade Rome from that point. None of the Roman sentries detected them, but the sacred geese of Juno did, and they began squawking and quacking and honking until some Romans awoke, came over, saw the Gallic tribes scaling the hillside, and were able to call other Romans over and repel the invasion. What stood out to me was that the geese actually saved Rome by being obnoxious. And I realized that that story is actually kind of a larger metaphor for why geese are not really raised or eaten that much anymore. You see, chickens and turkeys, raising them is simple and easy and convenient, and raising geese is not simple, not easy, not convenient. They need space. They need water. They're obnoxious. They're ornery. They're temperamental. They're aggressive. They're just not well suited to the kinds of mass meat production methods that we use today. Yet, some of those same traits that make them impractical and inconvenient are also exactly why they are so valuable. If they weren't waterfowl, if they were more like chickens or turkeys, they wouldn't be covered in so much delicious fat. And maybe you couldn't cook them medium rare, and the meat wouldn't have its unique and wonderful texture and taste. And if they weren't as obnoxious and persistent as they are, then Rome would have fallen to a Gallic invasion. Chickens are what we want them to be, but geese just are what they are. And that's part of what makes them good. I guess what I'm saying is, in a world of chickens, be a goose. So, that is the story of how I cooked my goose. Christmas came, the goose got fat. If you would like to put a penny in Good and Basics hat, you can find a link to do so in the description. We have a website with a donation link. You certainly don't have to, but if so, it's certainly very meaningful to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.